Hello, everyone. Welcome to our world today, the Unionist perspective, live discussion. We're very happy to be with you today, and we have a jam-packed program full of news from this week, which are like all different and more or less interesting, definitely to discuss. First of all, we will start with Alabama's Supreme Court ruling that frozen embryos are children. Um, and then we'll go into Russia putting nukes in space and how this will change the, I guess, geopolitical stability and also the satellite situation all over the world. We'll talk about how a data scientist went from doomism to climate change hope. And if we have time, we're going to talk about the hopeful story of a Ukrainian war vet encouraged to stay alive by his wife and how they put together organizations to help other wounded vets afterwards. So let's begin. First of all, in order of everything, we're going to talk about Alabama because this is our main topic. This is the most important. And yeah, I wanted to ask you guys, Sage and Isaiah, what do you think about this? If it feels like in the news in the US, we talk way more about this than in other countries with reason because this is a state decision. So I would like you guys to enlighten us about like what are the different components of the story, please.
Yeah, so it's an important story in the US because this ruling people see it as it could set the precedent for having a national fetal personhood law. That's something that anti-abortion advocates have been behind, some of them. And such a law would just say that it would codify legally that, like, from the moment of conception, like when sperm enters egg, that is a child and it has personhood and it has the rights that any person would have, within reason, right? Because it just an embryo. But so that's basically why it's important and the implications of it. It's also a big deal potentially for IVF treatment across the country because if more state courts end up ruling that embryos are counted as children, then the IVF clinics will probably either shut down their operations in the states or raise their prices considerably. And that's because they don't want to be held liable for the wrongful death of a minor. So this case was there were three couples in Alabama who had embryos stored at this facility, and there was an unacceptable breach of protocol in the facility, and their embryos were, destroyed. So um, they decided to like sue them and go at it from the route of like this was a wrongful death of a minor. And I don't know what motivated them to do that exactly, but that's what they did. And the lower courts were saying, like, no, like, this isn't the wrongful death of a minor because it's different when you just have like frozen embryos. But um, the Supreme Court of Alabama said that they do count as children, only for the purpose of this wrongful death law, though. So not for any other purpose, so that is important because it doesn't create the precedent for, like, I don't know, other personal rights, I guess, for embryos and fetuses. So, but yeah, that's basically what happened. And so now we're just kind of going to like unpack like what does this mean? Like what is this about like on a spiritual level? Like what is the truth in all of this? In all of this, these happenings and stuff like that. So, yeah. Oh, and I do want to mention the biggest IVF clinic in Alabama did already posit all of its services because of this, because they probably just want to be like assess the situation, and they don't want to move embryos around at all. They don't want to do anything with them because now they could be sued by the people connected to said embryos. So if they destroy them. So that's all.
Yeah. So last week we talked about the consequence of Roe being overturned in the life of one person, and the fact that doctors didn't want to operate on her um, and procure an abortion, even though her life was in danger, because they didn't want to have, they didn't want to have legal action taken against them because of that. And now we're seeing that Alabama um, does this where they treat frozen embryos as children. And yes, I understand why the parents would try to go at this angle if they wanted absolutely to win the case. And it would make the destroying of their embryos something that is much more damaging um, that I guess, you know, them not being considered living beings. However, the Supreme Court ruling kind of feels like, I don't know, kind of feels very weird. It's is there something in here that doesn't feel good? And the fact that doctors are already um scared to even operate in these things, like not open their clinics and things like that. It's uprooting so many lives, you know? And and obviously like in the same way where people are going to say like, oh, like your baby's life is in danger and you are in danger, but we're not going to operate in fear that um, we can be faced with criminal charges. Same with this, like we're probably not going to even consider having fertilized eggs in our clinic and freezing them because I don't know, like what could happen to us if a pregnancy doesn't take, um, if something happens to the embryos, if a, even like if imagine if a clinic shuts down and there can be preservation of all the embryos, like that could be weird and damaging for so many people. And so I'm like, it's not even about life or death. Like I wonder, like, did people even think before doing that? I don't know because like it's we're going outside of the realm of life and death, and I think it further proves that there's just like a level of wanting to control from everybody, really. So this is something to heal for everybody, for parents that sued on the case that the child would be a living being, and I'm sure that they meant well for them um, at that time, but like the fact that they appealed and the Supreme Court ruled something else is very damaging. So there's a level of control there. There's a level of control of bodies, there's a level of control of pregnancies and natural pregnancies and the choice of couples and the choice of women. And I don't know, it just feels so weird. There's just like this weird energy um of just, why would you do that? Doesn't make any sense. But that's my very, it's my first feeling. It's like my first reaction to it would be like there's something weird without going into details right now. How do you
Yes,
guys feel? Hmm.
I definitely agree with you that it does feel off. But I also, like I'm also the extreme of this continuum is that what happens under circumstances where embryos are abandoned? Does the clinic then get the right to sue for some type of maintenance because this embryo is considered a child? Because right now embryos get abandoned, they don't pay for storage costs. So the cost of keeping that embryo alive is now borne by the clinic or the state or whatever. So it's like almost a two-edged sword where it's a level of control, but it almost feels like very targeted control. And I would dare say it almost feels like what Shaleia mentioned very early on with the Roe decision, almost an attack on women, but then also the attack on the freedom to choose. And isn't that more enshrined in your constitution than anything else? And so, how does this decision start to erode those amendments? Because, I mean, at this rate, by the time we turn around, there's going to be a law prohibiting people from even considering pregnancy because it's so controlled. It kind of, and the purpose of IVF was to allow for the people who were struggling under those circumstances to fall pregnant to have an avenue to pursue it. But now they almost pursue it at not only great personal cost, but great personal risk, given that pregnancies cannot be terminated and all sorts of other things. And it almost feels like the life of the embryo starts to supersede the life of a living being.
Hmm. There's something that you mentioned, and maybe that's the weird energy. It's that IVF is one chance for LGBTQ plus couples to have babies as well. So that maybe, what the media, without exactly telling it, were kind of pointing out with saying that Alabama is already like a conservative state, the first to vote for um, abortion not being, legal and things like that, the first to apply it, and so on and so forth. So is it like it's a further attack on women because you know, for people that identify as female or have a gender female are in an LGBTQ plus couple, that may be the way to have children as well. So isn't that, but I think it's so marginally the percentage of people that have children. I think like the level of control that Alabama is just demonstrating, and as always demonstrated in truth, um, goes to the fact that it's going to hurt so many people just to follow a certain agenda that I think maybe that's the thing that feels off and doesn't make sense. But yeah, I think Sage wanted to say something, about that. So
Yeah, because I was just saying, like, I feel like this is partly like about ideological consistency, because like um oftentimes, in that anti-abortion sphere, they always say like life begins at conception. So ideologically, this is perhaps consistent with what they're saying. Like that is a life, but regardless of like what stage it's out of development, right? But when I feel into it and maybe I'm like numbed out or something here, or like have some block to the truth, but when I feel into it, it doesn't feel the same to have like accidentally or in some way destroying an embryo. It doesn't feel the same as having an abortion or it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel like when I feel into like, oh, an embryo was accidentally destroyed, it doesn't feel equivalent to the feeling of this was the wrongful death of a child, of a minor. Do you know what I mean? Like it just doesn't feel, I can't get myself to feel like those are like equivalent. And I don't know if this is just for ideological consistency or if it's like if people feel reservations against like science being so involved in conception, like with IVF, or if, like you said, LGBTQ couples, but the people who are most often affected by it are actually women who have undergone cancer treatment because radiation can kill off your eggs. And so you might want to save your eggs beforehand. So really, in a big way, it affects mostly people with fertility challenges or cancer patients. So, and I was surprised to learn that in 2021, 2% of all births in the US were through IVF. And I was like, that's mass 2%, because knowing like what you've got to go through with IVF, like it's a very like, you know, as Jeff and Shaleia shared when they were going through it in like their videos and stuff, it's like a very like intensive process and it's no joke to go through it. So I don't know. Those are my feelings about it. Yeah.
I feel like you touched on something quite important in almost the dichotomy of what it feels like when you consider a growing fetus versus an embryo. And I think that the disconnect feels a lot as if an embryo is probably still considered in object terms and it's not considered in human terms. So that's where that disconnect feels. But I agree with you that almost the ideological thread that their ideological thread is connected. I'm not so certain that it serves the greater good of humanity in any one form or another because of the pure feeling of almost Big Brother decides when you breathe and when you burp kind of.
I was not expecting that last example, but I would say kind of the same. I'm like it's not. I wish we would stop talking in terms of like living being, non-living beings, and things like that, and say like what is the most loving for all people? And right now, the most loving is not to. Why would we give rights to um? Why would we give the rights of a child? Because like it's just not living, it's just not about a living being right now. Children, like they can live through their own means. Obviously, like you need to care for them, but they have legs, they have arms, usually. They are individual beings. Why do we give rights of an individual being biologically to something that cannot live without constant sustaining? And that is what feels off. It's not about, oh, it's living, oh, it's not living. It's not that. It's just like you're complicated. You're complicating the things and the lives of everybody through your ideology. And when an ideology doesn't love most people, I think it should be put into question, right? not the fact that there is a soul or there is a consciousness or it's living or things like that. It's not that. It's about like, am I through my actions and through my ideology? Because the ideology is like pushing you to take actions. So is it actually a good ideology or can change ideology without changing beliefs? In order to like respect the life of others would be the big question. And I think as long as we don't do what feels loving and good for many people, like we don't really understand how to rule and how to I almost want to say like love thy neighbors because it's truly it. Like are you loving other people? And yeah, that's just my thought.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And Granville, you touched on it too, on loving our neighbors. Are we giving the same equivalence to the importance of life that is here right now as we are to, let's just mention it scientifically, embryos are a group of cells. That's all it is at this point. So are we giving more importance to a group of cells or are we giving more importance to, let's say, foster care, to children who are in the system because like their parents are unable to take care of them? I don't see any great push or great financial budget for that, but rather a whole Supreme Court ruling on something that hasn't even come to birth yet.
I agree too. It's more just about like what's the most loving thing in the situation.
Yep.
And I wasn't feeling either that was the most loving thing to be like, oh, like if you like in this case, like accidentally by mistake, like destroy embryos, now you're like open to a wrongful death of a minor lawsuit. Like that feels really, just not a loving way to approach this situation. I don't know.
So here's another farcical ramification of this decision, right? So these clinics are now very fearful of even transporting these embryos out of state. So does that open the clinic to frivolous claims of keeping embryos hostage? The ramifications of the ruling are very far and wide. And the contemplation of the law, if it's ridiculous, it really can't be the right thing. And so if we were to say on a scale of ridiculousness, and it's literally what you spoke to, Nadia, what are we giving precedence to here? And what actually, from a life and respect for life point of view, are we putting weight on? So, like, I almost feel like there's a level of ridiculousness, but because it's now been almost enacted as a court ruling, it just makes life so much more complicated as opposed to what the opposite of and it's almost the opposite of what everybody's asking for in asking for greater stability. We're seeing that around the world in the shift of the political decisions, in the shift of voting decisions, in the shift of removing stringent laws that prohibit people from actually making a living. And then we go to this extreme in the US where you have to wonder, is this the deflection to literally show how potentially ridiculous the politics of the Republican Party are or not? And is that not the way to erode the election base prior to the elections?
And IVF is very expensive. So those who go forward with this, they're not making any frivolous decisions that, oh, I'm just gonna store a bunch of eggs, which are their eggs. So it should be their decision on how it's stored, how it's done, everything. So it is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see what the consequences are nationwide. We definitely had Joe Biden expressing himself against it, obviously, a few days ago. Doesn't feel like, I don't know, is it going to go to the Supreme Court? What are they going to rule out? Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see for now. So yeah, moving on to the next story. We have Russia putting nukes in space. So, Granville, do you want to just touch upon it and give us a clear base to start discussing this?
So the one thing about the newspaper, well, the article's headline is a little bit misleading. So it's not necessarily that they're putting nukes in space. They are developing possibly anti-satellite weaponry that may have a nuclear warhead in them or may be nuclear powered. And that's the extent of the knowledge of what this is. But the concern is obviously that if there are weapons in space that can target other countries' military satellites and communication satellites, it affects their ability to respond to crises and attacks and those kind of things. And so what this does is it opens up the debate about an armament race, an anti-satellite armament race, because the fact of the matter is many countries will then try to do it as a defensive mechanism as a deterrent to other countries to use what they have there. And doing that, you can't necessarily be certain that, yes, we're all doing it in a defensive play, but there's never going to be an offensive play that comes, because once the weapon is there, it's there. It's not like there's a switch that says, oh no, it's only defense mode kind of thing, you know? So there's a big concern around the potential for countries like the US and China and Pakistan, who's very close to developing their own nuclear weaponry, to also respond and start to consider anti-satellite systems in space. This also goes against a 1967 treaty that was signed between the US and Russia that prohibits nuclear weapons in space. There was also a treaty that prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in space, and we can understand, because chemically that fallout will eventually come into our atmosphere, and it could literally go anywhere because of the fact that the Earth rotates. So there's a lot of implications for there's potential implications if this does come to fruition. There is no real information about what it is exactly, except that there is potentially the development of some type of nuclear-powered anti-satellite weapon. And obviously, it will probably garner some significant strategic responses, because countries are going to say, well, I need to be in a space where I can also play in that space and deter any negative action from other countries who have these kind of capabilities in space. So the ramifications start to then open up the debate around an armament race. And I think that's the biggest concern, is that once it opens up, it just opens up significantly, because everybody will want to get some type of a defensive position established in space.
That feels so Cold War to me. But it's ridiculous. And also, with what funds do they like NASA is not even capable of like finishing their plans of going back to the moon. So what are the funds that they have towards doing that is my question. But I mean they could, but doesn't this lead exactly to the same place in the end of the 80s and 90s where they're just in the nation because of it? I'm not sure, but well, I could be wrong, but like maybe we have more funds, more capital than before, but it feels a little bit like that. It feels a little bit old and a little bit weird as well. But yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to also give appreciation for Granville pointing out that the title of the article that we found was misleading, because it's basically from the headline people would get Russia's putting nukes in space. Russian space nukes.
Cold War again.
Right.
Been trying to nuke us forever.
Yeah, and it's just like, A, this is just a report from US intelligence or whoever intelligence. B, this isn't actually happening now, according to that intelligence. C, oh, can please not now. And C, I don't remember, but basically like this is classic, like journalism is like profit driven, and so they want to do stuff that's going to be hot and get people's attention. But if you really care about all of the issues at hand, and you're not just wanting to like, yeah, get high off of a scary article title, you'll read it and you'll be like, oh, no, it's not actually what they said, which does give us the fun job of detective work. But I prefer like when I was doing like my research for the Alabama story, I liked the articles that were just very like dry and cut to the chase, but really detailed, you know.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I gotta give props to the Alabama articles and even videos that we had that were very to the point and not trying to dramatize anything. And I wish we could have had that as well for the Russian experience, but because there is so much emotion behind Russia and what it's doing right now, I guess we have less of that. But yeah, I understand what you were saying. Did you want to add anything else?
No, nothing's coming up right now. Yeah.
So I think the one thing that kind of stood out to me in this little analysis was that it kind of read a bit like a playbook, you know, or almost a playbook to a movie script. So you could almost see the storyboard developing. Oh, they did this, so now we must respond, and then we must get our act together so that we can get in that space. And it literally just almost felt like a storyboard, but it wasn't so sensationalized that you can, apart from the headline, that you could almost say, well, you know, it literally is creating havoc. The headline may create havoc if you don't read the content, but when you read the content, it almost reads like a storyboard for a movie. Like I could see a movie script developing off of that kind of thing, which in and of itself does have some histrionic value, let's be honest.
Yeah, and I do feel that the guy who is writing it, I think in the article he says he's like an expert on this, like nuclear warfare or something like that. But I think because he was writing it for the context of the article and the media company, you know, what their agenda is, like it felt a little bit more like let's get excited about this, but in like a you know, fearful sort of way, unfortunately. But if you ever go online and you read like stuff written by like some US military person who doing like a report on like hey, these are the military capabilities of Russia or this country, and this is what we can do to respond. It feels very, those, when I've read those, it doesn't at all feel scary. There's no drama in it. It's fascinating, and I find it fascinating, but it doesn't have any of that, like, it doesn't have as much clickbait value, let's put it that way. You know what I mean? But he did write about it in a very like factual, thorough seeming way. So hang on.
Yeah. But title is giving Independence Day, I gotta say. Like that's one of the first thing I thought about. So maybe like let's say rule in a factual way. His boss said like, hey, we need to attract people to this. So how can we make that story clickbaity? And that's maybe what's come up from this. Like maybe he didn't choose the title, which would make sense, I would say. But like going back to Russia, there's a complete disregard to history, to the respective boundaries put in place in the 60s, and a complete obliteration of the lessons that they should have learned from the end of the Cold War. I don't know about you guys, but we started talking about this, and we started talking about it in social impacts. At the time it was like social no harmony. I don't remember what our discussion was called at the time, but we talked about it, and there was like Jeff, there was like Jeff and Shaleia, and there was this thing about like seeking harmony. Thank you, Nadia. Oh my God. Our former discussion was seeking harmony when we started talking about the news. And there was a discussion about how they were perpetrating, Russia was perpetrating the patterns, the motifs of Cold War and their beliefs there, that there was like the West was attacking them. And to be honest, like yes, I did see that. I did see that in Ukraine, but I didn't see a whole lot of that, especially being in Europe, having Russian immigration here, um, people just like chilling and just being there. I didn't really see that, feel that. And like more and more, especially in the past like 2, 3 weeks, I see that, that um we're still in Cold War with the rest of the world, especially the West and America, about certain things, and we want to raise them towards having complete control of our territory and also of our claimed territory, at least for Russia, and other things. I don't know. There's just this thing about like more and more we see their hand in the way that they play the geopolitical game, and it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good for sure, for me at least. But there is something about it's very telling how people can just do the same things because they didn't learn their lesson, or at least it's what it's looking like right now as we're speaking, end of February 2024. It may change, but it feels like it's just we're doing the same dumb choices in a different way. So yeah.
Can we pinpoint some patterns that happened before the Cold War that is like repeating itself here? I know we discussed it in a broad way, but I'm familiar with some of the patterns that happened right before the Cold War, but it does feel like that, like the propaganda that's starting up again. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Are you talking about like are you saying that it's like the government, the US government wanting to get people to be more suspicious of Russia? Because is that what you're talking about? Or?
I know that was a stage that happened before the Cold War with propaganda. Were there any steps that Russia had taken prior to the Cold War that is repeating itself here?
Yeah, well, I guess you could almost say the Cold War pretty much started. Yeah, I guess like right before you could say that there was a Cold War. Russia, the Soviet Union invaded and occupied almost all of Eastern Europe, and East Germany, right? So, and that's kind of what they're doing again now, like with Ukraine, but and so I guess it's the same, and I don't know. But yeah, I don't know.
I don't know, because Soviet Union was pretty young during World War II. It was like a few decades old. And it's really like going from the Tsar, Nikolai the Second, to a communist republic was pretty much a big shift in Russian history and a complete overturn of the way that they functioned and the choices that they made. So I don't necessarily see this. The only thing that I can think of was like the beginning of 20th century when they tried to do war in China, in the north of China, Manchuria, with Japan, and they lost. But being expansionist, taking parts of Europe or being at war with the West, it didn't really happen until the end of World War II. So, and Cold War was, I guess it's precedent enough to kind of explain what we've been feeling in terms of like people choosing democracy or not, people gaining independence as well in the second part of the 20th century. It's rather new for a lot of people, and it's pretty much because World War II made us enter into this new system of wanting to choose more freedom and more democracy for ourselves in general. So I guess it's just like we have to see, it's kind of like the second act of all this geopolitical instability, like Cold War and then calm and then conflicts again, and we'll have to see where this goes. We don't have anything what we can really actually base this on for now. I would say. Sage, do you agree?
Yeah, well, I mean, they always wanted to take over Eastern Europe, and they always wanted to expand their borders, and that was always their strategy, is to like get people to be barriers to others so others couldn't invade them, and I don't know if that's really happening now, but yeah. But it feels like they're willing to do anything to undermine the West, and they don't care about agreements anymore, within reason, right? Because they don't want to like start an all-out conflict because they know that they would probably lose. But yeah, I guess it brings up the question of arms races too, and if it's the same as like the nuclear arms race, if this ends up happening. And I don't know, like the previous nuclear arms race, and I feel like it could be different because you want to defend your satellites. You want to have plenty of defenses for all of your satellites because they're very important to the function of the whole world. And like, it could have big consequences versus like competing with Russia to see who has more nuclear warheads. When you end up with each country has over 5,000 nuclear warheads. Like, you're just like, why? Like, why do you need 5,000? That seems like a huge liability to have. So that's what I was thinking of, but I don't know.
So the one thing that kind of stands out to me is that they've always been they've always been the aggressor in a lot of these initial conflicts. But like literally, Nadia, the whole almost counterintelligence kind of stuff with propaganda, is one of the tactics. Then also we have to consider that historically, and you guys may correct me if I'm wrong, but historically there's also been a sense that the Russian leaders have been plagued by mental challenges in the form of mental illness in certain respects. And those have been significant leaders at significant times in Russia's history. So, there's almost this level of instability that filters out into the reality of the Russian population, and therefore into the reality of humanity. And we find it a lot because there's always been this imperialist sense of win at all costs, absorb at all costs, and in those patterns, you will find the rights abuses that we've seen across history for however long, because people are used as pawns. Weaponry is used as pawns, and it's literally what Sage was speaking to around buffering yourself so that people have to kind of make significant strides to get to you. To me, that doesn't speak to a sense of mental stability. Why would we use other humanity as shields?
Do you feel that leaders in Russia almost have a sense of false prophethood, that because they become leaders of such a massive land, they have to take on the role of overtaking and of the past leaders?
I think they become drunk with their own power. So once they get a bit of the power, because it's a bit more absolute than in other countries, they do have an inflated sense of self, and they have to maintain it in some way. And while we may not agree with their methods, sometimes their methods have proven effective for them.
Yeah, so I guess we'll have to look out with how the story evolves, definitely. I think we won't have any more answers until it's the very end of that chapter of what would Russia do, or how does this end, who wins, because the one thing that it does and definitely says about Russia is that they're not going to stop until either they win or the West wins in some sort of new cold underlying way that doesn't involve going to World War III. So yeah, it's definitely we'll have to see in what ways this plays out. But finishing up this conversation today, we have our last topic, which is data scientist Hannah Ritchie going from doomism to climate change hope and explaining why. So this story was found by Nadia, and I think it was really nice. It's just about basically a millennial teenager, just like most of us here, feeling the world was doomed, then being a scientist, a graduated scientist, and just almost following half of a scientist at the moment and saying that the world is meant to be doomed in some way, because it's already too late in certain ways, and then going back on this for several reasons. And Nadia, I don't know if you have insights that you'd like to share with us about this inspiring story, but yeah, let's discuss that. What pushed her to climate change hope?
Well, this was a story a bit while ago, so let me refresh my memories. Are you sure I posted this? Oh.
Yeah.
I know I posted about climate change and glaciers melting.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, the data scientist, I think I posted that one. I was looking back and found it
Oh,
in there.
sorry.
That's okay. So basically, yeah, I was just reading over that. Yeah. So basically, she was saying that there's the crux of it is like there have already been so many ways in which the world has reversed or has begun to reverse negative climate uh, patterns, that she's basically saying that there's no way that we can't do the same for like climate change. And she was saying that you can't prove that it's too late at some point. Like you can't say, like she's saying, like based on her expertise, it's never too late to do something. And she talks about like the well-known like principle that if people feel like it's too late or it's about to be too late or whatever, they will just do nothing and have no will to solve the problem. And so like she talked about different examples of it, like the ozone, right? The ozone layer issue, like ozone pollution. I mean, the CFCs were the chemicals in like hairspray and stuff. A lot of things that I think air conditioners too, or whatever, where they were making the hole in the ozone layer, and the concentration in their atmosphere has gone down by 99% since their peak in 1986. That's been very effective. When they first started to push for banning those harmful chemicals, industry was against it, and industry was rolling out their kind of like their propaganda, saying like this is going to harm the consumer and everything's fine, the ozone layer's fine, you know, our chemicals don't do this. And of course it was all a lie, or they were just ignorant. But that's a question. But it ended up working, and now we don't have that problem anymore. And we did that. And like there's so many other things, like acid rain has really reduced around the world. Most cities in China have actually begun to reduce their air pollution. She talked about like hitting peak pollution. Like when will we hit peak pollution on the planet and then start going down from there? And so these peaks have happened with other environmental issues. And so why could it not happen with CO2 in the atmosphere, was basically what she was saying. So
Yeah.
I thought that's cool.
Yeah, I like that. I like the fact of like if we say we're doomed, like it will provoke inaction and paralysis. And the fact that data and science says that there is never or never too late moment. And I think she offered us not really a way out, but a reality check right now. It's kind of like when you're kind of you're kind of shook by someone, and you just like come back to your senses about something. And I enjoy this because like no, not really like being shook by someone awake, but I enjoy the fact that she's very realistic about that, and that she proves with data that hey, like we said, like the ozone was going to just continue having a giant hole in it, and it got resorbed. And air pollution was never going to be down, and it got down in cities. And I think the thing that we say is that we consider 2030, 2050, or like 2100 being years where we can't go back from natural catastrophes and other things like that. However, she shows that the planet has a huge, I guess, resilience cycle. The planet, and that's a good thing. Like Earth functions in cycles. Like for example, glaciers, they melt, and then they go back to solid and things like that. And it's not going to be the same, of course, but they go back in seasons, like they melt and they go back in solid and things like that. The air pollution can be reduced, the ozone layer, it got resorbed, and I think it's just showing us that, hey, maybe we'll have hurricanes in like category 6 or something. We don't know, but maybe we can go back from them. You know what I mean? And I enjoy that. I enjoy that because nobody said that we were all going to die after 2100 hits, you know? Nobody said this. And yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I'm really glad you posted that story, Sage, because it's telling about our human body too and how we can recover just by a choice and continuing to give love to it. And that's the same thing we're doing with this earth, as like we're praying for this earth, that loving energy is definitely rejuvenating. And even our story about fungi being created so that it could absorb the radiation from Chernobyl, which human beings could not have think thought of a solution for, and Mother Nature has. So it's very much showing how alive our earth is and how reflective it is to our inner world and how powerful it can be to heal.
I also think that the message of extremes is quite challenging because again there's two things that happen. It's that the significant fear that creates inactivity, or the significant fear that has extremists acting in ways that then affect other people because, well, you're polluting in the ocean, so you deserve to die kind of crap. So, it's all this kind of fear mongering that brings about these extremes. And unfortunately, we are still not at the point where we can say, as humanity, we are completely stable from a social relational point of view. So it does debilitate some people where it drives other people to extreme behavior. And that contingent in the middle that does actually act reasonably also starts to feel saturated by all this bad news and horrible stories and everything else. So you actually literally have the sense of, what's the point? And that is the problem. The problem is when we get to that what is the point stage, that it becomes dangerous. So I do appreciate that somebody is saying, hey, there is an optimal saturation point that actually will plateau it and probably push it in the opposite direction, because in order for it to have even a tenth as much damage as it had before, it would have to grow exponentially and quite quickly. So, we also need to understand how saturation points work, because that will also help us as humanity to just sometimes relax when we hear all these extreme stories.
And it also brings a point on sovereignty and valuing ourselves, because we may have not known how harmful the chemicals in AC is. And companies could have been continuing to reproduce this, harming us, unless we took a stand and said that, we don't want this in our body. We don't want this in our environment. So really taking a stand on sustainability and valuing ourselves allowed companies to kind of revert and go back to, let's think about the environment and not just money.
Yeah. And just like the idea that the whole of life on Earth is based on cycles. And it feels way more natural to the planet and to us to think in this way. And I think this is very interesting. And I think we should go deeper into that. We have reached our hour, so I hope we can continue with all of these topics, which were very interesting, in the next few weeks. While we do that, I would like to thank everyone who watched us live and who's watching us on YouTube. And, If you enjoyed that discussion, definitely hit the like button, subscribe, share this so that we can do more of them. And yeah, I just have to say, see you next week. When definitely share if you have interesting stories for us to talk about. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye bye.